I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I remember that Sunday evening as a kind of soft bruise upon the sky, a bruise that deepened as the bells of St. Simeon's began their slow toll. Rain had settled into the stones of the quad, leaving the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and old limestone. I had no business being at evening prayer. I was restless, slightly hungover, and perhaps hoping for the obscure relief of ritual when one cannot quite believe in it. The chapel door yielded with a sigh, and I stepped into a hush built over centuries. There were not more than a dozen worshippers scattered among the pews, each like a note held too long on an organ stop. I chose the back bench beneath the gallery, from where one can see everything without appearing to look. The candle caught me at once. It stood beneath a memorial plaque to a long-dead bursar, its flame trembling in a way that had nothing to do with draught. There was a dissonance about it. The other candles had been extinguished after morning service, but this one burned on with a quiet defiance, a pale beacon against the carved oak. I opened my pocket notebook, more to steady my thoughts than to record anything, and idly filled a crossword clue from that morning's Times. False light, 6 letters. Will-o'-the-wisp did not fit, neither did beacon. My mind went on picking at it, even as the chaplain intoned something about mercy and the prodigal. The verger passed along the aisle, a stooped man with hands like knotted rope. When the service ended, I stayed seated, letting the others file past me. He came to snuff the lesser candles and paused when he saw me watching. "Been like that every night for a fortnight, sir," he murmured, "though no one lights it." At first I thought he meant it as a devotional curiosity, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He bent close to pinch the wick, then hesitated. "Better leave it," he said, as if explaining a superstition he half despised. I stood at last, feeling the chill of stone through the soles of my shoes. My head still throbbed faintly from last night's wine, and the faint incense of candle wax reminded me of other chapels, other women, and things I had failed to do. Outside, the quad was empty, except for a bicycle leaning at a crooked angle against the cloister wall. Its rear lamp glowed weakly, left on by some absent-minded scholar. Another false light, I thought. Lewis telephoned me later that evening to ask some trivial question about a parking ticket. His voice was full of Sunday domesticity, the clatter of cups in the background. I made a note of the time. When he rang off, I found myself still staring at the crossword. The clue circled twice. There was something else in the chapel that evening, though I only recognized it after. A smell perhaps of wax mingled with old paper. A faint mark on the floor where someone had knelt too long. A shadow of movement near the vestry door that did not belong to the verger. These are the things one notices without noticing. They remain like the aftertaste of a wine you cannot name. I took a slow walk along Merton Street before heading home, the drizzle tracing small rivers down my coat. Students passed me in pairs, their laughter curiously muffled in the damp. Through a window I glimpsed a woman turning pages of a score, her fingers moving as though they remembered a melody she no longer wished to play. Back in my flat, I laid the notebook beside the crossword on the table. False light, mirage, feint, decoy. Each possibility suggested its own kind of misdirection, and each was unsatisfactory. I poured a small whiskey, no water, and let the amber settle. The candle's image stayed with me, the way it burned as if watched over by someone unseen. When one spends long enough in Oxford, one grows used to its small mysteries. Misquoted inscriptions, rearranged books in the Bodleian, anonymous notes slipped under doors. But some things carry a weight of intent, a gravity one feels in the spine rather than the mind. That candle was one of them. I did not, of course, know then what it heralded. Only that it had touched some nerve of foreboding in me. I closed the crossword, left the clue unsolved, and jotted a single phrase in the margin. False light. Even now, recalling it, I see the flame trembling in the chapel gloom, as if it knew I would return under darker circumstances. Morning came thin and colorless, the kind of light that drains rather than restores. I had only just coaxed myself into some semblance of wakefulness when Lewis arrived, his knock polite as if he feared disturbing something more delicate than my digestion. He stood with that awkward patience of his, hands deep in the pockets of a rain-dark coat. "There's been a death at St. Simeon's," he said, as though deaths were uncommon in Oxford. Dr. Adrian Lyle, found in his rooms beside the chapel wall. I knew the name, of course. Lyle was a historian who published little and appeared less, a man rumored to hoard papers as other men hoard coin. I asked Lewis what had been found. "Collapsed near that same memorial plaque where I had seen the candle last night," he replied. "Heart gave out, so it looks." But there was still a candle burning beside him. I took my coat and we went together through the half-empty streets. Oxford on a weekday morning possesses a hush more profound than Sundays, as if the stones themselves are reluctant to wake. At St. Simeon's, the porter led us up a narrow staircase, the wood creaking like an old confidant. Lyle lay where they had found him, body already removed, but the imprint on the carpet still visible, as if absence had its own weight. The candles stood stubbornly lit beside the plaque. The air smelt of wax and something sharper, perhaps the residue of spilt brandy. A torn scrap of paper had been placed in a small evidence bag on the desk. Lewis handed it to me with the solemnity of a parish clerk. "Quem didiligunt," it read, the rest trailing off as if the hand had faltered. The phrase should have been complete. "Quem didiligunt, adolescens moritur," he whom the gods love dies young. Attributed to Horace by the lazy, but properly belonging to Menander. The scrap had altered it in a way that was neither accident nor ignorance. D, not di, a small slip, yet such slips are rarely small to those who live by texts. I read it once, twice, then again, my eye catching on the ellipsis that followed. Ellipses never conceal, they gesture toward what someone wishes us not to see. Lewis watched me, waiting for some pronouncement. I told him the heart may indeed have stopped, but the heart is not always the origin of death. He frowned, perhaps thinking I had been at the whiskey already. He asked if the phrase was significant. "Only to those who believe words can lie," I said, which is to say, to almost everyone. I studied the desk. Books stacked in uneven towers, a half-finished crossword folded beneath a Latin grammar, ink stains like small eclipses across the blotter. The crossword was yesterday's Times. A clue had been circled. Torch, 6 letters. Next to it, Lyle had written false, then struck it through. From the window I could see into the quad where the rain had begun again, thin and insistent. A lone student hurried across, coat pulled to the chin. His head bent in the same posture Lyle must have assumed each night, stooped over his books until the hour grew indistinct. Lewis spoke quietly, as though afraid to wake the dead. "The college doctor has written heart attack. Nothing more." I asked him whether Lyle had been known for ailments. "None that I've heard. Lived quietly, hardly seen, except in the chapel." The chapel, of course. I looked back at the candle. Who had lit it again and why? The verger had said it burned each night, but now it seemed to burn also at death. A ritual or a signature. We left the rooms with little more than we had entered, save for that fragment of Latin gnawing at me. Words misplaced are clues mislaid, and I have long trusted the misquote more than the confession. As we crossed the quad, Lewis asked if I believed the heart attack. I told him I believed in very little, which is not the same thing as disbelief. Later, at my desk, I laid the scrap beside the crossword, "Quem didiligunt." I wrote beneath it one word, ellipsis. It stared back at me like the faint trail of smoke after a candle has guttered out. The gates of St. Simeon's rose before us, like a sentence half-spoken, their iron ribs slick with last night's rain. Lewis and I paused beneath the arch, where pigeons had left a hieroglyph of droppings on the stone, the smell of damp mortar rising from the ground. Beyond, the quad lay unnaturally still, roped off with temporary barriers and scaffolds that climbed the chapel walls like a frozen ivy. Renovation notices fluttered in the breeze, each one promising renewal but reading, to my eye, like an embargo. The college was sealed, if not in intention, then in spirit, and the case felt already like theatre in a locked room. We crossed the quad slowly. A workman hammered somewhere out of sight, each strike muffled as though under a pillow. In such quiet, the smallest detail enlarges. A window left ajar despite the rain. A bicycle chain newly oiled, its links glinting like a minor revelation. I told Lewis we would begin with the bursar. She would know the hidden geography of keys and permissions. Judith Greaves received us in a paneled office that smelt of beeswax and old grievances. She was a compact woman with the sharp profile of an antique coin and a manner honed on disputation. She gestured to the armchairs, but did not sit. A tragedy, of course, she said, though not wholly unexpected. Dr. Lyle's habits were not conducive to health. I asked which habits she meant. Late nights, secrecy, a fondness for strong drink. Heart failure is hardly mysterious. Lewis took notes while I let her words collect like sediment. On her desk lay an open volume of Catullus annotated in a tight, dry hand. Her thumb rested on a passage about false friends. When I asked who held keys to Lyle's rooms, she replied that the porter managed them, but added, with the faintest emphasis, that scholars at St. Simeon's valued privacy. She hoped we would not disturb the college more than necessary. We were shown then to a small common room where the remaining residents waited with the careful politeness of those who know they are under a lens. Marcus Venn, the junior colleague, leaned against the mantel as though trying to borrow its dignity. His hair was meticulously parted, but his tie bore a dark fleck of something, ink or wine. Father Keene sat near the window, hands folded over a small prayer book whose pages were already curling with use. Laurel Day, the visiting poet, stood apart by a bookshelf, running her fingers along spines as if tracing a secret text. I spoke lightly, asking where each had been at the time of Lyle's death. Venn claimed he had been in the college library preparing a lecture on medieval ciphers. Father Keene had been conducting a vestry meeting with 2 church wardens. Laurel Day had taken a walk along the river despite the weather, needing, she said, a break from the cloistered air. Each answer had the polished sheen of rehearsal, but it was Venn who betrayed the faintest tremor. When I asked about Lyle's private papers, he looked at the floor for a second too long. He kept them locked away, he said, his voice catching like a loose string. The bursar may have known more. They were, after all, his life's work. The tremor vanished as quickly as it came, but its echo remained. I made a small mark in my notebook. Voice approximately candle flicker. Lewis asked whether Lyle had enemies. Father Keene replied that in academia, rivalry was inevitable but rarely mortal. Laurel Day gave a half smile and said a secret makes its own adversaries. Her accent stretched the words into something both amused and rueful. Through the window, the scaffold cast a lattice of shadows over the quad. I watched a drop of rain fall from one bar to another, a small migration of water through a man-made cage. The crossword from this morning's paper lay folded in my coat pocket. One clue still unsolved. Sanctuary. 5 letters. In that moment, seeing the college's barricades and listening to these cultivated voices arranging their alibis, I wondered whether the clue's answer might be crypt rather than haven. We left them soon after, their politeness sealing the air behind us like wax on an envelope. The corridor smelled of plaster dust and lavender polish, an incongruous pairing that lingered on my coat as we stepped back into the quad. Lewis muttered that they all seemed plausible. I told him plausibility is Oxford's native tongue. He asked what I had noticed. Only that the gates are closed, I said. but not to everyone. As we walked out beneath the arch, I glanced up at the carvings of saints and scholars eroded by centuries. Their faces were blank yet watchful, like the college itself. The rain had stopped, leaving a sky the color of lead. I thought of Ven's tremor, of the bursar's thumb on Catullus, of a poet's fingers on unread books, and of a candle still burning somewhere behind us. I returned to the chapel that morning before the tourists could scatter their echoes across the stones. The air still carried the scent of last night's wax, a sweetness overlaid with something like dust from old hymnals. The verger awaited me near the vestry, cap in hand, his face composed yet faintly strained, like a man rehearsing a confession he does not want to give. He began before I'd asked. The candle had not always burned. It first appeared, he said, after Dr. Lyle received a letter that unsettled him. An anonymous thing slipped under his door, ink smudged, but words sharp. Old sins, the letter called them, without naming which. The verger spoke of it as one speaks of gossip overheard at a funeral, softly and with more knowledge than he wished to own. He had lit the candle the first night at Lyle's request, but the nights after that were someone else's doing. Lewis moved quietly around the chapel, measuring distances with his eyes. The candle stub from the night of Lyle's death had been replaced. A fresh one stood in its stead, unlit like a sentinel off duty. I asked the verger if he had seen anyone tending it. He shook his head, yet I felt his pause. He had glimpsed a shadow, perhaps, but a shadow is not a person until named. Later, in the buttery where the coffee was thin and bitter, Laurel Day sat at a corner table with a notebook open before her. She spoke without being prompted, as though confession were a form of poetry. 2 days before Lyle died, she had risen early to walk off a dream and had passed the chapel just before dawn. Through the leaded glass, she saw a figure in a dark coat slip between the pews. It moved with a deliberation that was almost ritual. She had not gone in. Why should she? It is not uncommon in Oxford for figures to drift through chapels at unreasonable hours, yet something in her voice, a minor quaver at the phrase dark coat, set a thread vibrating in my mind. We left her and climbed to the library. The room was half-shuttered for renovations, ladders propped like stage scenery against the stacks. Here the smell of paper thickened, dry and papery sweet, a smell that carries all the hushed betrayals of scholarship. Lewis bent over the register kept for rare borrowings and touched a fingertip to a faint smear. "Wax," he said, showing me the pale fleck. Someone had handled a candle before signing out Lyle's book. The book in question was a small quarto on coded medieval verse, its vellum spine cracked like old paint. It had been Lyle's most private interest, the bursar had told us. I asked the librarian for the list of names. She brought the register, pages fluttering like thin wings, but when I turned to the most recent entries, a sheet had been neatly excised. Not torn, not clumsily removed, but cut with a blade so clean it left no feathering. Only the faintest ridge along the binding betrayed the surgery. Lewis muttered that the thief had been careful. I told him careful people leave patterns even in absence. The missing page meant not concealment but emphasis, like an erased line in a poem drawing the eye to the blank. We lingered a while in that muted room. Through a high window the spire of another college angled into view, dark against a pearl-grey sky. Somewhere a workman dropped a plank, and the echo rang like a muffled bell. I felt the investigation narrowing, not outward. The candle, the letter, the missing page, they were not clues scattered randomly, but petals around a center we had not yet named. As we descended the staircase, I thought again of Laurel's dawn figure, the dark coat. A man or a woman? She had not said. The verger's hesitation, the wax on the register, the excised page, each a small flicker of false light. In my pocket, the morning crossword waited, a clue half solved. Keeper, 7 letters. Guardian would fit, or Warden, or Verger. But the answer might be something older, something the language had lost. I did not share the thought with Lewis. He prefers solid ground, and this was still missed. Outside, rain began again, the first drops scattering across the quad's flagstones like hesitant footsteps. I drew up my collar and looked back at the chapel. Its door was closed, but I could almost imagine the candle still burning inside, keeping its own counsel. The room they had lent me at St. Simeon's overlooked a side quad where ivy crawled across blank windows like handwriting no one had deciphered. It was late afternoon when the rain shifted from drizzle to a fine mist, and the stones began to sweat with a dark sheen. I had Lyle's annotated Horace spread open on the narrow desk, its spine sighing each time I turned a page. The ink of his notes had bled in places, pale ghosts of thoughts pressed too hard. The misquoted line stared up at me from the margin. Quem didiligunt. He had underlined it twice and written a small mark that looked almost like a question mark, but not quite. I traced it with my finger. In the previous day's Times crossword, a clue had nagged at me all morning. Beloved by the gods. 4 words. I had left it blank on instinct. Now I saw Lyle had been circling the same silence. Words misplaced, like keys in the wrong pocket, can reveal more than they conceal. The claret from the college cellar tasted of damp velvet and resignation. I sipped it slowly, jotting possibilities in my notebook. Adolescence moritur, dies young, patronage, elegy. None settled. The misquote substitution of D4 day might be nothing more than slip, yet Lyle was not a man for slips. He was a man for signals. Lewis came in with his usual half-apologetic shuffle, damp coat shoulders beading water. He reported that Marcus Venn had once lost a competition to Lyle over a manuscript discovery in some provincial archive, a prize of money and prestige both. The rivalry had been whispered about in the senior common room for months, but no one had thought it mortal. Lewis's voice carried a faint undercurrent of disapproval, as if scholarship itself were suspect when laced with envy. I noted the detail, though rivalry alone rarely kills. He went on. Greaves, the bursar, had kept the college endowment under an iron thumb. She had clashed with Lyle over allocation of funds for acquisitions. There had been a heated meeting 2 terms ago, the minutes discreetly absent from the official record. Father Keene, meanwhile, had been borrowing Laurel Day's early chapbooks from the library, sermons echoing her published poems almost line for line. I asked Lewis if anyone else had remarked upon this echo. He shook his head. No one listens to sermons, he said, except the preacher. I wrote a single word on my pad. Plagiarism, then struck it out. Too early for conclusions. But the faint tremor in Venn's voice yesterday returned to me now, like a candle flame remembered in a dark room. The library bell tolled the hour, and the sound came muted through the rain, a resonance rather than a chime. I turned another page of Horace and found a slip of paper used as a marker, a torn piece of lecture handout bearing the word cera, wax. Beneath it, Lyle had written only one phrase, not false light, but hidden. I looked up. Lewis had drifted to the window, peering out at the quad. He asked if I thought the death still natural. I said nature is generous in Oxford. It lends its name to many unnatural things. He smiled faintly, but did not press me. I reread a passage in Keene's last sermon, printed in the chapel newsletter. Its phrasing mirrored a stanza from Laurel's debut collection, almost word for word except for one small inversion. Old sins clothed in new grace becoming new sins clothed in old grace. Such inversions are either accident or artifice. In Keene's case, I suspected neither. The claret in my glass had grown thin and sour. I poured the rest into the basin and watched it swirl down the drain, a modest libation to absent gods. The crossword lay beside the book, yesterday's date staring up at me. I penciled in the clue at last. Loved by the gods. Short life. The answer fit, but felt wrong, as if a cipher had been solved, but the message still withheld. Lewis asked what I had found. I told him only that a misremembered poem is sometimes a confession in disguise. He frowned, but let it be. Outside, the rain had turned to a silvery drizzle again, scattering the light into fragments across the glass. I closed the Horace with care, as though shutting a door on someone still inside. The candle in my memory flickered once, then steadied. We were not closer to the truth, only to the texture of the lie. And that, I knew, was something. It was late in the afternoon when Lewis brought me the envelope from Lyle's Effects, his hand hesitant as though passing a sealed verdict. Inside lay a single diary page, its edges slightly frayed yet cut so evenly that the blade itself seemed complicit. The handwriting matched Lyle's, but the tone did not. The entry spoke of meetings with Laurel Day under cover of dusk, of a secrecy so obvious it read like a performance. Blackmail, shame, the small dramas of academia. Here was a motive packaged neatly enough for a press release. Lewis muttered that it explained everything. I told him explanations that arrive too quickly are often invitations, not truths. He gave me a look that meant I was being difficult again. Perhaps I was, but the ink had bled differently from Lyle's usual entries, as if the hand that wrote it pressed with more caution or less conviction. We met Laurel in the same low-ceilinged room off the cloister where the light always seemed filtered through gauze. She was seated with her back to a portrait of some long-dead benefactress, her posture a study in composed fragility. When I showed her the diary page, she lowered her gaze, and for a moment a tear traced a path down her cheek. Yet her voice, when it came, was steady. She said Lyle had never approached her in that way. He had sent her instead a poem, coded, she believed, but never deciphered. She handed it to me folded twice, like a secret she had carried in a pocket too long. I opened it. The lines were spare, almost skeletal, each word aligned with an initial that spelled nothing at first glance. But the rhythm was wrong for confession. It moved sideways, like a river cutting an unexpected bend. I told her it felt less like an apology than a warning. She nodded once, a small pulse of agreement or relief, I could not tell. Lewis shifted near the door, impatient with my silence. He asked Laurel if she knew who might have forged the diary page. She said only that old sins leave many hands eager to write new scripts. Her accent softened the edges of the phrase until it sounded like a lyric. After she left, I remained at the table with the poem spread before me. Candle, ash, keeper, vault. Those were the words repeated, but in varying order, as though rearranging a lock. At the margins, Lyle had scribbled a small shape, an open eye, perhaps, or a keyhole. That evening I returned to my borrowed room. The rain had stopped, but left the flagstones shining like black glass. I poured a small whiskey from the bottle I kept in my bag. College claret had dulled my palate enough for one day, and read the poem again under the desk lamp. A crossword from the morning paper lay beside it. One clue unanswered. False light, 6 letters. I tried decoy, beacon, ignis. None settled. I thought of Laurel's tear, singular and controlled, and of the forged page arriving at just the right time to redirect suspicion. The timing was too elegant, like a rhyme forced into a sonnet. I penciled a note. First, false light. Later, half asleep, the coded poem still echoing in my head, I dreamt of the chapel. A single candle stood on the lectern, flame guttering against an invisible draught, while organ music rose from nowhere, a low swell that carried fragments of Laurel's voice, or perhaps Lyle's. In the dream I reached to snuff the candle, but it extinguished itself, leaving a curl of smoke like a question mark dissolving. I woke in darkness, The rain resumed, and for a moment could not tell whether the scent of wax in the room was real or imagined. On the desk, the poem lay where I had left it, lines dim in the lamp's dying glow. I wrote a single phrase at the bottom of my notebook, not confession, but warning. Then I closed the book as if closing a door I was not yet ready to open. It was Lewis who found the pattern first. He came to me mid-morning with the college phone log folded under his arm, the paper soft from his handling. He had underlined a column of numbers in his blunt pencil. Calls to the same antiquarian bookseller in Jericho, he said, each a few days apart, all placed from Lyle's extension. It looked routine until you saw the frequency, too regular, like a heartbeat rehearsed. We went there that afternoon, rain starting again in small, stealthy drops. The shop was wedged between a shuttered tailor and a shop that sold moth-eaten academic gowns. Inside smelled of foxed paper and pipe ash, the light thin and particulate, like dust held in a slow shaft. Books leaned against one another on crooked shelves, and somewhere a clock ticked with the unhurried patience of a cat. The man behind the counter had a face like an unsealed envelope, pale and expectant. He recognized Lyle's name at once, but his eyes flicked to the door before he spoke. Lyle had been trying to buy back a compromising item from his student days. He said at last, something that had surfaced in a private collection. He would not say what. Scholars have their own skeletons, footnotes, that never reached print. As he spoke, I let my eyes wander. Behind the till, half hidden by a ledger, a photograph leaned against the wall. 3 young men in college blazers, faces sharp with the arrogance of potential. Lyle at the center, Marcus Venn on his left, Father Keene on his right. Their arms rested lightly across each other's shoulders, but the space between their hands told another story, a distance disguised as camaraderie. I asked about the photograph. The bookseller said it had been left with some donated volumes years ago. He had meant to return it, but forgot. His voice thinned at the edges. I asked who had phoned last. Lyle again. No, he said after a moment. The voice gave his name, but it was not him. Lewis shifted his weight on the creaking floorboard, his notebook poised. He asked how the man could be sure. The bookseller's gaze drifted to a cracked mirror above the door. Because I remember Lyle's voice from our student days, he said. The one who called was too careful, like an actor learning a part. I thanked him and left a card on the counter. As we stepped back into the drizzle, Lewis asked if I believed him. I said, belief is a poor tool, but memory, even flawed, has its shape. He muttered something about ghosts. We walked slowly up Walton Street toward the canal, the smell of wet timber rising from the moored barges. In my coat pocket, the crossword from that morning waited. 1 clue still empty. Mimic. 5 letters. I thought of the caller's careful voice and penciled in alias without looking. At the next corner, we paused under an overhanging plane tree while a bus splashed past. Lewis asked what I had seen in the photograph. 3 young men, I said, and a gap where a 4th should have been. He looked at me blankly. Sometimes absences tell more than presences, I added, but he only shrugged. We cut back through a side street lined with terraced houses, windows steamed with Sunday dinners despite it being Thursday. I could feel the coded poem in my inner pocket, the paper warmed by my body. The words candle, keeper, vault now seemed less poetic and more like coordinates. By the time we reached the car, the rain had steadied. Lewis fished for the keys. He asked what the compromising item might have been. I told him it was not the object, but the reaching for it that mattered. In Oxford, the past is a market stall where everyone buys back their own shame if they can afford the price. We drove off in silence. At a red light, I glanced at the crossword again. Alias fitted but felt provisional, like a coat borrowed for an evening. Outside the window, the river glinted between warehouses, a pale thread unspooling. I thought of Lyle's voice, replaced by another, the false diary page, the candle burning under no one's hand. First false light, then false voice. Back at St. Simeon's, the quad lay empty, scaffolds dripping, and the chapel door closed as if it had never opened. In my mind, the photograph behind the till began to shift, Lyle turning away, Ven's smile becoming a grimace, Keen's hand resting not in friendship but in restraint. I made a note in my book. Mimic. 5 letters. Perhaps not alias after all. Perhaps echo. Rain had begun again, a faint drizzle blurring the edges of the quad into a watercolor of stone and scaffolding. Lewis and I were summoned to Judith Greaves's office, a room I'd come to think of as a reliquary of grudges. The bursar stood behind her desk like a small but implacable sentinel, papers neatly aligned before her. She announced that she had found something among Lyle's effects which, she believed, would clear the college of unpleasant speculation. She passed me a document with the brisk pride of a chess player revealing a forced mate. It was a will or an amendment to one, dated only a month earlier. In it, Lyle bequeathed his private papers, notebooks, and research to the St. Simeon's archive under her stewardship. Her voice sharpened as she explained the importance of these materials, their scholarly value, the need to prevent them from vanishing into obscurity. The implication hovered. Lyle's death had been unfortunate, but entirely natural, and any suspicion of her involvement was as ill-founded as it was insulting. Lewis studied the signature, his brow knitting. He murmured that the ink looked fresh. I said nothing. My eye had already caught a slight incongruity. The witnesses were names I recognized from the porter's roster, men who would sign anything for the bursar. The hand that had drawn the final flourish of Lyle's signature was perhaps too careful, as if practicing the rhythm of another man's pulse. Greaves offered tea, which neither of us took. Her thumb stroked the margin of a Latin text on her desk, just above a line about inheritance and trust. She spoke again of the college's dignity, its future. I heard only a faint echo in her words, a repetition of something Father Keene had said in his sermon, old sins in new vestments. At the time it had struck me merely as a rhetorical flourish. Now, standing amid her beeswax and brass, I felt the phrase return like a whisper beneath the floorboards. We left her office with the will folded into an evidence envelope. Outside, Lewis muttered that it looked bad for her. Papers, motive, opportunity. I replied that a case which arranges itself too neatly is like a crossword clue that fills itself in. He asked what I meant. I told him I would know when the letters matched. That night I took the coded poem from my pocket and unfolded it under the small lamp of my borrowed room. The rain had deepened to a steady hiss against the leaded panes. I lit a candle on the desk more from instinct than need. Its flame cast a trembling ellipse across the paper. I read the lines again, slower this time. Candle, vault, keeper, ash. Each line beginning with a letter I had not noticed before. My pencil traced them downward in the margin. K-E-A. The candle flickered once, guttered, steadied, N-E. I sat back. Keene. It was not a confession written in the old style, but a name buried like a fossil in new soil. Lyle had been warning someone, perhaps me, perhaps no one in particular. The bursar's altered will might be genuine, a red herring created by another hand, or it might be her own sleight of pen. But the acrostic glowed with a different kind of intent. I poured a small whiskey, no water, and let the warmth rise into my throat. Lewis would want a plan, but plans in Oxford have a way of rearranging themselves overnight. Through the window, I could see the chapel's faint outline across the quad, a shadow within shadows. Somewhere in its nave, a candle would still be burning under no one's name. I closed the poem and snuffed my candle, leaving the room in darkness. The smell of wax clung to my fingers, and in it I caught the memory of organ notes from my dream. A low swell carrying a warning I had not yet learned to hear. First false light, then a false will. The truth remained, like an answer penciled faintly in the grid, waiting for a firmer hand. The chapel was nearly empty when I entered, its scaffold silent as rigging at low tide. Afternoon light bled through the stained glass in thin, fractured shafts, touching the pews without warming them. I walked slowly up the aisle, footsteps softened by old carpeting. Father Keene stood at the lectern with his back to me, reciting Latin under his breath. The words rose and fell like a tide that had forgotten its shore. He turned when he heard me, but did not startle. "You have questions," he said, as though this were a continuation of confession rather than its inversion. I moved closer, inhaling the mingled scents of candle smoke and damp stone. I asked him to repeat the phrase he had just spoken. He obliged, rolling the syllables with a scholar's ease. Yet as the line came, quem didiligunt, his tongue shaped the second word too flat, the vowel slipping where it should have lifted. It was nothing to an ordinary ear, but Lyle's ear would never have forgiven it. I felt the tiny misstep echo inside me like a pin dropped in a crypt. Keene went on speaking, perhaps unaware of the flaw. He spoke of Lyle's relentless curiosity, his meddling in old grievances, his pride. He said scholars ruin themselves on secrets they cannot leave alone. I asked whether his sermons had always drawn from Laurelde's poems. He blinked once, then smiled, a thin curve. "A priest must draw on many texts," he said, "old and new." Lewis was not there. I had sent him on a trivial errand to give this moment space. Alone, I listened to Keene's voice, its cadence polished but slightly off, like a bell whose clapper had been replaced. The crossword clue from that morning returned to me. Poisoner, 8 letters. I had penciled in nothing. Now I wrote it in my mind. Digitalis. I glanced toward the vestry door. A small decanter of communion wine sat on a side table, stoppered but not sealed. The glass held a faint greenish tint that might have been the light or memory. I asked him when he had last seen Lyle alive. He said Lyle came for confession late at night, a man seeking absolution from no one. His voice was steady, but the hands resting on the lectern pressed down too hard, whitening at the knuckles. I told him Lyle had been planning to expose someone's old plagiarism, a theft from Laurel's early work. He neither denied nor affirmed it. He said only that sins are seldom new, only newly dressed, old sins in new vestments, the same phrase from his sermon, the same line hidden in Lyle's coded poem. It landed now with the weight of a key turning. Keene stepped back from the lectern, eyes on the stained glass rather than on me. He began to speak of youth, of mistakes, of words borrowed in desperation that had become his voice. He said nothing of poison, nothing of fear, but his breathing changed, a slight catch at each inhalation, like a man remembering an earlier self with distaste. I moved to the pew nearest the plaque where the candle had burned. Its holder was empty now, only a rim of hardened wax clinging like frost. I thought of Lyle kneeling here, accepting the cup offered by a man whose sermons he had recognized as echoes. The heart attack had been too neat, the diary page too neat, the will too neat. Only the mispronounced vowel, the smallest tremor, had broken the pattern. Keene's voice fell into silence. He looked at me then, and for an instant the polished cleric's mask slipped, revealing the tired student from the photograph behind the bookseller's till. He said nothing more. The air between us filled with the scent of extinguished wax and something bitterer. I rose, notebook still closed. Outside, rain began again, dripping from the scaffolds in small, exact intervals. Lewis would return soon and ask what I had learned. I would tell him only that the sound had been slightly off. He would not understand yet, but he would in time. I walked out of the chapel, the echo of Keen's mispronounced tag still in my ears, a faint dissonance leading me away from certainty but toward the truth. In the crossword grid of the case, a new word had surfaced, faint but legible. Digitalis. I did not write it down. Some answers are better left unscribed until the final square is filled. The interview room they gave us was a former tutor's study stripped of books, its walls lined with empty shelves like sockets without eyes. A faint smell of old polish lingered under the sharper scent of rain drifting in from an open sash. Keen sat opposite me at a narrow table. His collar had been loosened, but still clung to his neck as though reluctant to surrender its office. He stared at his hands, which rested palm down on the wood, fingers splayed as if in benediction or restraint. He began, without prompt, his voice a muted liturgy. "Each night I lit the candle," he said, at first as a prayer for him, then as a warning. After a while, it became the only prayer left to me. His eyes stayed on the grain of the table while he spoke. Lyle had been persistent. He had recognized his own phrases echoing from my sermons, the thefts from Laurel Day's poems. He threatened to expose me, not for ruin, but for some kind of penance. I feared the humiliation would undo everything I had built. His tone never rose, not even when he spoke of the digitalis slipped into Lyle's nightly wine during confession. He described it like a ritual, each drop measured, each evening prayed over. I asked him why confession, why the candle. He said he had hoped the flame might consume his guilt before it consumed him. He smiled faintly at that, a brief flinch of humanity passing across the priest's face. Lewis sat near the door, pencil unmoving, his usual questions silenced by the quiet. Keen went on speaking until the room seemed filled with a low, exhausted chant. He said the candle had outlived its purpose, yet each night he had lit it again, not as warning but as habit. He said nothing about remorse, only about a ritual that had hollowed itself into him. When he fell silent, the rain deepened, a soft percussion against the window ledge. I closed my notebook. We rose. He followed without resistance, his footsteps muted on the corridor's threadbare carpet. Back at the chapel, the verger waited, cap in hand. Without speaking, he approached the plaque where the candle still stood. Its flame trembled, a small defiance against the damp. He cupped his hand, pinched the wick, and drew away. Smoke curled upward like a question lost to the rafters. The holder was left empty, a ring of hardened wax marking where the ritual had lived. Outside, Oxford lay washed and dim, rain drifting across the quad like slow ash. The scaffolds gleamed wetly, ropes sagging with beads of water. Lewis walked beside me under the cloister, his coat collar up. He spoke of a crossword clue from that morning. Final music for the dead, 7 letters. He said the answer was requiem. I did not reply. The word felt too neat, too complete for what had transpired. My mind had already wandered elsewhere, to a small cafe years ago, a woman whose laughter carried a minor key. We had parted without anger, just the slow erosion of 2 tides moving away. I remembered her face lit only by a candle on a winter table, the way the flame had trembled when she spoke her last words to me. We reached the gate, but did not step through. Rain gathered on the brim of my hat, slipping down in small, precise drops. Keen had been taken away by another door, his voice already fading into official language. The chapel behind us stood quiet, its windows dull as unpolished coins. Lewis asked if I wanted to get something to eat. I shook my head. He fell silent. We stood a moment longer under the arch, the quad empty now except for the faint print of our footsteps on the stones. The flame died, but the wax remembered.